the aftermath of the shooting of the gangster Chris Kaba, the Home Secretary has said that she will introduce a presumption of anonymity for firearms officers facing criminal proceedings following police shootings, up until the point at which they are convicted.
Let's talk to a former firearms officer, police officer, Tony Long. Tony, morning. I was arguing for this from the very beginning of the trial, when we knew that the police officer had been charged and was named. He's had to go into hiding. He was cleared by a jury in 3 hours. He's had to go into hiding. His children have been taken out of school. There's talk of a £10,000 bounty on his head. If he'd had anonymity in the court case, perhaps he would still be living at home with his family.
No, absolutely. And this is about Martin, not about me, but my own personal experience is that my name first surfaced in the press in 1987 after I was involved in a shooting. And here we are now in 2004, and I still have CCTV cameras on my address. I still have an alarm system direct to Scotland Yard. And I bump into people in the street that recognise me and say, oh, most recently, you're Tony Long, aren't you? Yeah, you killed my best mate from school. You know, however many years later that is. And so, I mean, Martin's quite fortunate insofar as the judge did at least make an order that his photo wasn't to be taken, and he was given access to getting in and out of court without being seen. But nevertheless, his name is out there. And as you said, you know, there is some intelligence to suggest that there is people specifically looking to harm him or his family. And it's the family that I really feel sorry for. They're the ones that are the most vulnerable in all of this.
And Tony, look, the judge may have made an order about his photograph, but it was the idiot judge who allowed his name to be published in the first place. And it doesn't take social media very long to find out who and where he is and to put that picture online.
Well, no, and absolutely. And I think that the biggest irony that no one else seems to have picked up on is that, of course, while Martin was waiting for trial, there was a trial that would have involved Chris Kaba had he been alive. And we've all seen the footage of him opening fire in an incredibly crowded dance hall and then chasing the suspect out into the street to try and shoot him. But because he was mentioned in it, the judge for that trial allowed every single defendant, not just mention of Kaba. I mean, he could have simply been given a code to refer to him as a witness, but there was absolutely no need for any of the other defendants to be granted anonymity, but they all were. And out of the 5 people or so that appeared in court as co-defendants, those that were convicted were obviously named, quite rightly so, but those that were part of the process, that were part of the 6-7 gang that weren't convicted, were able to walk free from court without a blemish on their name, without anyone ever knowing that they had been defendants in that trial. Now, you know, why wasn't that same privilege allowed to a serving police officer that had, yes, taken life, but had done so in the protection of his colleagues and the public?
Tony, you were charged and tried for murder, weren't you, in 2013 as a firearms officer?
Yeah.
What was it like emotionally for you to go through that process? I know it was many years ago now, but you're the person who's walked most closely in the shoes of this most recent police officer. What kind of toll did it take on you emotionally and your family?
Well, I think the family was the most important bit. I mean, I've been, like a lot of men, quite selfish in my career. You know, I was enjoying myself doing exciting stuff and working with a group of men and women that, you know, it was just a pleasure to go to work with every day and doing stuff that, you know, movies are made of. I mean, it was brilliant. But I didn't really realise, you know, the toll that had on my family and on my relationships. I'm divorced, but then so are a lot of coppers. But when I actually went to trial and I looked up after having been given my not guilty plea and saw my wife, you know, with her head in her hands, shaking uncontrollably, and my son, who's in the Royal Marines, you know, and has done multiple tours of Afghanistan, crying, you know, it kind of hits home to you. Yeah, to me, I'm sitting in the box. I mean, I had the privilege or the I'm not sure whether it's a privilege or not, but while I was sitting, I'd already sat as a juror myself in a trial, and I know how fickle juries can be. And so, it's a big leap of faith, really, having looked after and protected the people of London for 33 years, to then rely on some of those, Londoners, complete strangers, to make a decision about your future life.
If the Home Secretary hadn't intervened in this way, Tony, would your fear be that actually men and women in the police force would say, thanks very much, but I'm not going to be a marksman? Because they don't want to put them and their families through what you've been through and what Martin was put through.
I think so, absolutely. And I think the other issue, if I can just briefly mention it, is that there's obviously been a bit of a furore because the public now know what sort of character Kaba actually was. Mm-hmm. And of course, that Gangster. The jury were denied that information on the grounds that, well, the officers didn't know who Kaba was. And the defendant didn't know who Kaba was, so that way we shouldn't allow that information to influence the jury. But then, did Martin have a computer-generated overview, a bird's-eye view of the scene in those 10 seconds when it went from flash to bang, where he could see exactly where all his colleagues were? No. Could he see what they could see through their body-worn cameras so that he could be satisfied they were safe? No. Could he see what the helicopter was seeing? No. But the reality was that the jury was shown all of that. So you can't argue in one breath, or we can't have the jury influenced by knowing that Kaba was an absolute criminal. And in the same token say, we can influence them, though, with computer-generated reconstructions that were made many, many years later, and that where they can watch it at their leisure and freeze frame. So something has to be done about that as well, I'm afraid. It's not just anonymity is a fantastic step forward, and I feel privileged that over the last few days, I've been able to voice, what I know my colleagues or former colleagues aren't able to say, and I hope that may in some way have influenced that decision. But there is more to be done.
Yeah. So in the aftermath of the shooting of the gangster, the serial gangster Chris Kaba, there are fresh calls for politicians like Jeremy Corbyn, Diane Abbott, and the London Mayor Sadiq Khan to apologise for frankly, they were lionising him.
Delighted to say we're joined in the studio now by Daily Mail columnist Dan Hodges, who has been looking into this story, Dan, haven't you? And you've written a piece all about this and who Chris Kaba was. Just tell us who he was, actually, for people who may not understand what he was up to.
Well, he was, as we now know, and it's important to stress, there were efforts to actually cover up and keep from the public his background and criminal record. He was a violent criminal. He'd been involved. He'd actually shot someone in the days leading up to his own killing. He was a violent criminal with a very significant criminal record. He had a domestic violence order against him, and he was part of a notorious South London gang, the 6-7 gang, that ran and is still running protection rackets, targeting and intimidating the local community in South London that Chris Kaba's defenders are now saying should be rising up in his name. And I find it inexplicable the way that senior political leaders and senior community leaders are continuing to lionise this individual and try and turn him into a martyr, given now we know exactly who he is and what he was doing.
And I suspect, Dan, some of them were hoping these reporting restrictions weren't lifted because the judge lifted the reporting restrictions. You and I knew what this bloke was already. We were very privileged. And I suspect they'd have carried on knowing all this because they've got their agenda and they were sticking to it. Nasty racist police, black people have no chance against the police.
No, absolutely. And obviously this has become a political campaign now. And the campaigners were very well aware that if this information came out, it would completely change perceptions of the case and the incident. What I can't understand, though, I mean, you said, obviously, you and I are in a privileged position. Obviously, a number of the senior politicians who were campaigning for Chris Kaba and are still, to an extent, campaigning for him, were also in that position, but seem to keep carrying on. I mean, I cannot understand why Sadiq Khan is continuing to sort of, as it were, express his sympathies for this individual who was terrorising the the very city that Sadiq Khan is mayor for.
And firing a gun in a crowded nightclub in Hackney, which was crowded with his fellow black men and women.
Yeah, that's the point. It's the black community that were being targeted by this guy. They were the people who, as you say, were the victims of his violent crime, were the victims of his firearms crime, and were victims of him and his gang's extortion. And as I said, to hold this guy up and sort of lionize him and beatify him is, to me, incomprehensible.
Racism clearly exists. It does exist in this country. I think it exists against everybody of different races. You know, human beings are tribal, and the problems have not gone away. But what I find really disturbing, Dan, at times like this, is why there are so few inspirational black people, particularly, I would say, black men, why so few of them will come out and say, this man does not represent us. This man who was a gangster and who died in a criminal situation, he is not who we are. Where are those people? Why are people like Diane Abbott not standing up and saying that?
Absolutely.
And Sadiq Khan could be saying
no,
that.
absolutely, and that's exactly it. I mean, there's this whole perception of, you know, the community are traumatised by this, and there's a perception there, firstly, that Kaba was obviously a central member of that community. As I said in the piece, he was actually a vulture preying on the local community. But also, as you say, it perpetuates these appalling stereotypes about what a black man in modern Britain is. And it's not Chris Kaba. He is not representative of anyone or anything.